In Independent Nation, New York Sun columnist John Avlon advocates for centrist politics and policies. This talk lasts 50 minutes.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. We'll do questions and signing at the end. Books are available up at the register. And if you'd like to find out more about events at Olson's, there's a sign-up sheet in the back where you can get on our email list, and we'll tell you about what events we have coming up. It's our pleasure to introduce John Avlon tonight, discussing his new book, Independent Nation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for coming. I appreciate it. I wrote Independent Nation because I thought it was important at this time to get something out there that tells people and shows people, more importantly, that it's patriotic to stand up to partisanship. And extreme partisans right now are dominating the national dialogue, and it's not representative of where the American people are at all. And so I think by showing that the vital center out there, the independents who in fact outnumber Democrats and Republicans, show that they're not in fact politically homeless, that there's a history and a heritage that's strong and decisive leadership, effective, inspiring leaders going back to Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, JFK. Teddy Roosevelt exactly 100 years ago ran for re-election as president. He was a reform Republican, and he was opposed by the right wing of the Republican Party at that time, the Wall Street big business crowd that thought of themselves as the backbone of the Republican Party. But he took them on, and he also took on the Democrats who ran the corrupt places in the big cities. He took on the party bosses and the power brokers. He started the environmental movement. He realigned American politics as a result because he got votes from progressive Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And that's the kind of example the Vital Center can set for political leaders today and for all of us, that kind of realigning leadership. Now, Harry Truman didn't back down when it looked like he was facing defections from folks in his own party. The Henry Wallace Soviet sympathizers in the progressive movement, they abandoned him. They thought he was taking too tough a line with Stalin. And Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats walked off the floor of the 48 convention. And Harry Truman, the man from independence, he fought a three-front war. And he won re-election. It was a principled stand. And again, he's remembered in American memory as a patriot, not a partisan, someone who stood up to special interests in the name of the national interests. That's the kind of leadership we want in this country. And that tradition is not only exclusive to presidents. People like Margaret Chase Smith, the lady from Maine who stood up to Joe McCarthy, Ed Brooke, first African-American popularly elected to Congress, standing up to separatists on both sides of the issue at that divisive time. Senator Moynihan of New York, more recently Rudy Giuliani in New York City, turning around a city that 5-to-1 Democratic registration as a reform Republican, and folks like John McCain who activate the Vital Center and get them interested. There's a real thirst out there for independent leadership. But the center is under attack from both sides. We've never seen partisanship like this in Congress. In 1980, moderates made up only 36% of voters. Today they make up 50%, but in that last 25 years, Congress has gotten more and more partisan. People are reacting against the intolerant voices of right and left they hear on the radio, on TV, and increasingly in Congress. And what's good to know is that people have been here before. You know, that we're not alone. We're not politically homeless. There's a quote that begins Independent Nation. It's from the Justice Department offices of Burke Marshall. There was a sign on the wall in the mid-1960s. It said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall catch hell from both sides." And that's still the position. It's a position of principle. It's under assault, but it's always proven right at the end of the day. The dividers, the demagogues on either side of an issue, they get attention. It's easier to cover them. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. But in our democracy, when one side takes a my way or the highway approach, it's the Vital Center that can forge meaningful coalitions and bring about real change. And that's what's lacking right now. Too often in Congress, the ideologues and the demagogues are driving the agenda. The special interests are outweighing the national interests. And this moderate majority out there in this country is not getting the representation they deserve. They're not getting their voices heard. So I think it's time to stand up to extremists on both sides. And that's, again, why I wrote Independent Nation, to show that there's a precedent we can call upon. Standing up to extremists on both sides and the professional partisans who demonize their opposition, who make it seem like their opponents are enemies. Well, there are really no enemies at the end of the day. These angry, intolerant voices are not represented of the American public, even if they sometimes feel this way. The problem is they alienate the vast majority. And they set off this pendulum swing in politics that I think we're all pretty familiar with. It's almost like physics in some ways. It's every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. You know, you get right-wing extremists on one side, and they provoke intolerant voices on the left on the other. And again, the center's left wondering who's speaking for them. The good thing is the numbers are on our side. We do make up the moderate majority in this country, and if demographics are destiny, we've got more reason to feel good, because 44% of young Americans are independents. So the message is getting out. There's a groundswell. There's a movement going on that the professional partisans aren't seeing. Right now, it's very fashionable to believe you just need to follow your base and everything will fall into place. That ignores recent history. It ignores common sense. And that's the real opportunity we've got. But we've got to stand up. We got to give a sense of balance to politics, but balance with backbone. That's been what's lacking in the vital center in the past. That's why it's important for it to be a respected self-definition, for people to understand the history that they come from. You know, the sensible center is not represented by these voices. And people say, oh, it's always been divisive in this country. It's always been partisan. But this is not an idealistic stand. It's quite realistic, and it is rooted in history. You know, the first contested presidential election in history was Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. You know, George Washington didn't want there to be parties. In his farewell address, he warned us against the baneful effects of the spirit of party that rendered alien to each other those who should be bound together by fraternal affection. Thomas Jefferson stood up and said, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. And that remains a timely message. And I think we can stand up to these professional partisans and these extremists on both sides. And we can change American politics over time as a result. There's a realignment going on. It's not done, and in some ways it's just barely begun. But it's going to happen. You know, internationally, we're seeing a struggle between freedom and fundamentalism. And unfortunately, we're seeing that same struggle in our domestic politics. Fundamentalists who want everything their way, who want their elected leaders to just get in line, walk in lockstep, not ask any questions, don't think for themselves. And in many ways, they want that from the elected, from the voters as well. But the sensible center out there is smarter than that. They deserve better. And they need to know that this is not the way things have to be. And they can send a message, because ultimately, the democracy we've got incorporates change. It moves to where the majority is. If only the majority can help its voice get heard. And there are other books out there as well, in addition to Independent Nation, independentnation.org, that make this case. The Radical Middle by Mark Satin. Websites popping up like centrist.org. The DLC has been fighting this fight for a long time within the Democratic Party with great success. So I think there's a movement going on if we can only start to think with one voice across party lines and affecting that kind of change. Because ultimately, the strength of the center comes from a really basic common sense but almost spiritual realization, which is that what we share as Americans is far greater than what divides us. And that's an insight that should infuse our politics. And it can lift up the way we think about our national discourse and bring about real lasting change. I'd really like to take some questions from you guys, and then we can get into some historical examples and all that. I think it'd make it more interesting for you and hopefully folks watching at home. We'll take a question.
Well, I just wonder how, with our current political system, we could possibly get a candidate from the center. I mean, this bouncing from one radical to the next. What's the reality of coming back to the center?
The reality is this election is going to get won in the center of the electorate. All elections are. I mean, to put it in sort of, you know, Politico-speak terms, soccer moms are centrists, so are NASCAR dads. But it's a little more profound than that. To go over the top, 50%, you need the vital center of the electorate to be on your side. You can't align yourself with the extremists in your own party. And, you know, if you look at voting returns, it's actually kind of amazing. 50% of American voters identify themselves as moderates. Only 30% call themselves conservatives, and just 20% are self-described liberals. Now, what that tends to mean, beyond the obvious, which is that liberals and conservatives need the moderate majority to get over the top and win election in this country, is that neither party can just rely on this lazy follow-the-base strategy they've been doing. And it's especially difficult to see, I think, in Washington, where so much in this city, so much in the political culture is all based upon this us against them dichotomy. Everything's Democrat versus Republican, left versus right, liberal and conservative. They can't conceive of centrism. They just assume it's a cynical strategy. They don't see what folks feel out there in the heartland, that partisanship is really totally irrelevant to the way people live their lives, to the solutions they want to see from government. They want to see solutions. They really don't care at all about this partisan bickering. In fact, they'd like it to calm down and quiet up a little bit. And I think the candidates are going to have to realize that. And the one who makes a more compelling case for the center of the electorate to bring in the independent votes to their side is the one who's going to end up being the president. And that's a rule as old as the ages. Actually, there's an interesting quote, because it's real timely and timeless. It's from James Reston, who was a New York Times correspondent. And a year or so after Barry Goldwater lost in a landslide, remember the self-described defender of extremism in the face of liberty is no vice, Lyndon Johnson overwhelmed him in the '64 election. James Reston wrote, "The decisive battleground of American politics lies in the center and cannot be captured from either of the extremes, and any party that defies this principle does not improve its chances of national power or even effective opposition, but precisely the opposite." That's a law like gravity, folks. It's still as true today as it was then. And folks better start listening, because it's going to have profound effects on what they love to feel is their only reason for existence, their hold on power. Take another question, please.
You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, and I was reading, I guess it was back in a USA Today piece that because of the whole partisanship in Washington, that I think the states are taking this Louis Brandeis quote about the states being the great laboratories of progressive change, and that the states were actually doing more of that currently. What do you think of like a new progressive movement coming up, or what do you think is happening in the states? Or
well, when Congress is deadlocked and extremely partisan, it's not very effective. So by transitive property, all of a sudden the solutions need to start coming from someplace else. What was really interesting in the last decade in particular is look at the changes in urban America. Urban America came back from the brink precisely because of a third-wave generation of mayors. And at the head of that class was my former boss, Rudy Giuliani, who showed that you could bring about change in a city. He was a reform Republican. It's a 5-to-1 Democratic registration advantage. People had really given up on New York City in many respects. It was frequently called the ungovernable city. People assumed crime had to go up, dependency had to go up, businesses had to leave the city. And Rudy Giuliani represented a broad coalition of folks who felt differently. And it was a historic tradition, going back to folks like Fiorello LaGuardia, who said there's no Democrat or Republican way to clean the streets. And Rudy Giuliani came in and was tough on crime and started waking up the bureaucracy. And he took on the idea that the city was necessarily a divided, balkanized thing. Instead, he said, look, it's one city with one standard. We're going to focus on what we share. And he turned the ship of state around. And all of a sudden, people again feel hope in urban America. And that experiment, that same consensus approach was starting to evolve in different cities at the same time. Richard Riordan in Los Angeles, Michael White in Cleveland, John Norquist in Milwaukee, Stephen Goldsmith in Indianapolis. The cities really were the laboratories of changes to a great extent in the 1990s. And it's because of this looking beyond partisan politics for the best solution. It's because these leaders look to the vital center. And I think you are going to see that continue. There's realignment going on, and still the Teddy Roosevelt progressives are sort of homeless. So we'll have to see over time who adopts that coalition and how it evolves. But more and more, you're seeing consistencies in the folks who are looking for an alternative between left and right, Democrat, Republican. They tend to be fiscally conservative and socially inclusive, liberal to moderate. That need's out there. It's not being met by either party right now. Certain individuals in both parties try to walk that line and speak that principled position. John McCain, John Breaux, Joe Lieberman, Olympia Snow, many others. But I think we're going to see it's just the beginning of that. The effects, the ripple effects of that movement that did transform urban America have not yet fully been felt. And it's going to be fascinating to watch, and it's going to realign politics in our time over time. Take another question. Mark?
How do you see the political parties evolving? Do you think one of them will, over time, begin to reflect a consistently centrist position? Do you have a preferred view of that?
I think that how realignment is going to ultimately shake down is obviously dependent on factors that we can only partially know. But I think one obvious schism that hasn't been reconciled, and I don't believe probably can be, is the rift in the Republican Party between the religious right and the libertarians. And they ultimately don't have all that much in common. One speaks for individuals, the other thinks in terms of groups. And we're going to see that fissure take place. I think the Perot vote is still homeless. These folks are fiscally conservative government reformers who are overwhelmingly secular. Neither party has fully fundamentally claimed them and brought them in, but Woodrow Wilson showed in 1912 that he could co-opt the opposition. He brought in the progressive movement, which had been aligned with Teddy Roosevelt's progressives, and laid the foundation for the New Deal as a result. So there's a precedent for this stuff. This is how realignments happen. To remain vibrant, to remain relevant, parties reach back into the center. When Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, the Republicans had been shot out of the White House. They were set up to lose their 6th consecutive presidential election. I mean, that's devastating. That's go-home stuff. And they were about to nominate Robert Taft. He was the party's favorite son, Mr. Republican, an isolationist. And they were going down this road to irrelevance, and Eisenhower stepped up and was bitterly opposed by the right-wingers in the party at that time. But he rescued the relevance of the Republican Party and committed the nation to a bipartisan foreign policy of internationalism. And that's an example that's still incredibly relevant. I mean, we've seen it in our own recent lifetime. Look what Bill Clinton did. In 1992, the Democratic Party had lost 3 consecutive presidential elections of over 40 states. Losing 40 states at a time, 3 consecutive presidential elections, you're irrelevant, and the answer is not going further to the left. He needed to realign the party with the middle class and the moderate majority, and he did that consistently and effectively, and as a result, he was the first Democratic president reelected since FDR. But it's amazing when you look at the Democratic field, over recent history, Democrats depend on the vital center to get elected. I mean, you look at the successful presidential candidacies really throughout the 20th century, and they're all, when the Democratic Party reinvigorates itself and associates itself with the vital center and lets the other party be associated with the extremes. You know, I'd like to make a point about policy opportunities of centrism, too, because they're frequently misunderstood. A lot of people just dismiss it these days as triangulation. It's a cynical ploy. It's a very Washington approach to the center. You know, oh, sure, hey, good politics, but no principle. And that's, in fact, precisely the opposite. And there's so many examples in American history where policy was taken from being a partisan issue to a national priority by folks who looked beyond the old dichotomies. Nixon in China is practically shorthand for the strength of the centrist position. Only a guy with impeccable, lifelong anti-communist credentials like Richard Nixon could have established relations with communist China in the early 1970s. If George McGovern had tried that, I mean, there would have been impeachment proceedings for another reason. And look at Bill Clinton and welfare reform. I don't think Ronald Reagan talked about it all the time, but I do not think he could have effected it without there being massive divisions and fissures in American politics. It took a Southern Democrat like Lyndon Johnson to push through civil rights bills and make them look like national consensus. It's enormously important legislatively to have a leader who comes from the center, who can realign politics and take things away from being this partisan issue. Say, no, we're not lurching to the left or the right in our politics. We're moving forward. It's a consensus position. People instinctively trust that. It's almost a political version of checks and balances, and they get it. Unfortunately, too many people in Congress don't because they're so blinded by the day-to-day partisanship that determines their entire worldview. And that's why it's important for us out there to start offering an alternative, realizing that it's rooted in history, that it's not just coming out of nowhere. Can I take another question? Yes, sir.
Given that Congress has been gerrymandered into being so partisan that I doubt in my lifetime it will change, given that the campaigns seem to agree there are 18 states worth fighting about in the current election, how do you propose getting the vital center vitalized and alive?
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned gerrymandering in particular. Let me talk for a second about that, because it's frequently the structures, the rules of the game, which are man-made, not handed down from on high, that end up cooking the books, so to speak. 90% of seats in Congress are safe right now. That's insane. It used to be, once a time in America, people chose their congressmen. Now congressmen choose their people. And the effect is that congressmen don't need to worry about a moderate, responsible challenge from the opposition. All they need to spend all their time worrying about is raising money and making sure that they don't get an attack from their extreme flank. So what does that do? It further polarizes politics. It further pulls people to the extremes, the elected legislators, and that further increases the disconnect between the American people and the professional partisans and the politicians. And that's part of what ails us. That's the reason people are leaving the Democrat and Republican Party. That's the reason independent registration is growing faster than those two parties. It's an enormously important part. There's another thing we saw, too. In the presidential primaries, we're just leaving this partisan presidential primary season. And what we see is that over time, these guys spend their days, weeks, months trudging through the states. On the good hand, they get to know people by face, by name, and probably better understanding of what problems are. But the other side of that in a closed partisan primary system is they spend a lot of their time pandering to the outer reaches of politics. That's what helps give these special interests a disproportionate influence over our politics. It's not that it's not important to have single issue folks having a voice, but it's the disproportionate influence. It's when they start driving the agenda. And these closed partisan primaries contribute to that. And one alternative is the open party primary like we have in New Hampshire. And that's why, John McCain in 2000 was able to beat George W. Bush by 20 points, in part because he ran a campaign that appealed to both moderate Democrats, independents, and Republicans. That's the kind of majority coalition you need to win. That's the kind of majority coalition you need to get elected president and govern effectively. And yet we're penalizing those sorts of appeals in the way the partisan primaries function. And that's a real problem. He did great in New Hampshire, and then he went to closed primary states, and all of a sudden the religious right basically exerted veto power. And the negative politics come. And that's what turns everybody off. And so diminishes the national discourse. So I think those are just two things, gerrymandering and having open party primaries, that can contribute to a more balanced national dialogue and more genuinely representative American politics. But it's also the folks in Congress's responsibility. And it's our responsibility out in America to have our voices heard. Ultimately, they will listen to the will of the people. But they're surrounded by the screamers on either side, and they just say, well, they must be representative, or I've got to listen to them because they'll wreak havoc on me. So the silent majority's got to start standing up and acting up and taking a position across party lines, cross-endorsing in some cases. Maybe it's a good housekeeping seal of approval. This guy does not pander to extremists. He's a responsible reformer. But these are the kinds of things that centrists need to do to start getting taken seriously and be treated and respected as the honest brokers in politics. That's one of the roles we can play. It's enormously important because our character as a country is independent. Please.
How close is Nader to the center?
Nader is about as close to the center as Pluto is to us. Ralph Nader is running a left-wing protest candidacy. He's doing it under the independent label. And a lot of people try to manipulate the strength of the center by essentially running a radical protest candidacy under the Trojan horse of the independent name. It's interesting, in the past third-party candidacies, they were extremist protest candidacies because the two parties were dominated by the moderates. So when you had a really outer limits position, you did a third-party independent protest candidacy. You did Henry Wallace in 1948 saying the Democratic Party's being way too hard on Stalin. I think we really just got to be friends with Uncle Joe and all my folks, and run a protest candidacy. Or, the Wallace on the other side, George Wallace, running a segregationist campaign not so long ago. But what we've seen that's really interesting and indicative of where the independent is, which is the independent vote is being in the center, is recently in the 1990s we had 3 governors elected as independents. It's really pretty extraordinary. And none of them were running extremist protest candidacies. All of them ran centrist candidacies explicitly in opposition to the extremism of the establishment parties in their states. Lowell Weicker in Connecticut, Angus King of Maine, and Jesse Ventura in Minnesota. All started speaking from the common sense perspective that resonates with so many of us, a fiscally responsible message that was socially inclusive. They didn't like the religious right or the professional advocates of the lifestyle left. So they ran an alternative candidacy, and they were enormously popular and in some cases effective as a result. And it's interesting what makes an effective independent leader versus effectively a protest official. In the case of Ralph Nader in 2000, that guy got 97,000 votes in Florida. Al Gore lost by 537. Al Gore had written a book on environmental policy. It's called Environmental Paul Revere. But the Green Party ran a protest campaign because he was not sufficiently radical for their tastes. Like there's ever going to be another presidential candidate who's written a book on environmental policy. 97,000 votes in one state later. You see the impact of this my way or the highway crowd. They can exert a disproportionate influence on American politics. And I think this time around, I think the Democrats in general, but the American people aren't going to get fooled again. I think they know what Nader is. I think it's a run of ego. And I think we can see through that now. The message of trying to shake up the two parties is good. The left-wing protest candidacy or the right-wing protest candidacy, that ends up having a deleterious effect. So I think that's what we'll see. But it's going to be close. It's going to be a close election. No one's exerted a majority policy yet. Another question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that moderates used to hold sway in both political parties. So how historically did it get to be the way it is now?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
You mentioned that moderates used to hold sway in both parties. So historically, how did it get to be the way it is now with partisans dominating?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's so many great examples of it, particularly from mid-century. When Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, he was frequently called an Eisenhower Democrat because he worked so often with President Eisenhower to forge consensus legislation. I think the pendulum swing started to occur when our country got enormously divided. It's not a surprise that in the late 60s, a bloody and divisive time, that social condition would bleed over into our politics. From the Democratic Party standpoint, I think the fallen currency of the word liberal, which used to have some degree of respect and coherence, came when the anti-war movement in the late 1960s drifted into an anti-American movement. And I think that was just deadly for the Democratic Party, which is why you see a lot of them using the word progressive now. They've just sort of given up, and that was obviously that evolution was increased by other trends. I think in the Republican Party we saw the what Pat Buchanan romantically calls the crew-cut militants of the Goldwater era. I think they exerted a profound influence over the Republican Party over time. It's amazing, when I was writing the Goldwater chapter, that one of the chapters in my book's about Rockefeller versus Goldwater in the 1964 Republican primary, because I wanted to understand, how did Goldwater get the nomination? How did that happen? What was Nelson Rockefeller's weakness? And that's why Independent Nation contains the stories of people centrists who've succeeded as well as those who failed. I call it a collection of heroes' journeys and cautionary tales, because I don't really believe that politics is a science. I believe at its best it's an art, and its worst it's something like a war. But in all cases, history is our best teacher, and that's where we can learn how folks have succeeded or failed in the past, and that can provide the blueprint for us going forward. Nelson Rockefeller failed for a number of reasons, not least of which was personal. But when the Goldwater conservatives took over, it was interesting. They took down the picture of Abraham Lincoln and portrait of Eisenhower from the wall at the RNC headquarters. It's a profound statement of principle, but there it was. And they were so heady about the ideological purity of their movement that they went down to the greatest defeat up to that point, equaled only by McGovern's equal left-wing candidacy in 1972, an equal extremist movement that was equally repudiated by the American people, as these candidacies tend to be. And I think, though, that when that generation grew up, Reagan was incredibly smart. He was a conservative, but he was always careful to show that he wasn't an extremist. If you go back and look at his convention speech in 1980, even then, he's reaching out the whole time to Democrats and independents to join his cause, to redeem America. He quotes FDR's 1932 convention campaign speech 3 times in his convention speech in 1980. He was reaching out for those Reagan Democrats even then. At speeches he would say, I want to, the Democratic Party didn't leave me. I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And he would appeal for the support of the good and decent Democrats of the JFK and Truman tradition. And one of the things that's interesting analyzing politics now is sort of where are the folks who the Republican Party is reaching out to? Where are the Democrats who are defecting in large numbers? It's existed in the past, and I think the conservative movement took control of the Republican Party to some extent, but they were always careful to reach out. You know, taking George H.W. Bush as Reagan's vice president as opposed to Goldwater's choice of Miller, who had called JFK Hitler. But at that time, the pendulum starts swinging. The right wing takes control. It provokes an equal and opposite reaction. In fact, the strength of the right in the 80s is in part a reaction to the excesses of the liberals and the left in the 60s and 70s. And so this pendulum starts swinging. But it's not good for the national dialogue ultimately, and it does create this massive disconnect with the American people. So that's one way that where we get where we are. The extremists end up feeding each other. And look, you know, we're lucky in America. You know, internationally, when this has occurred throughout the 20th century, we had German people's fear of communism fueled the rise of Hitler, and then, you know, fascism created the strength of communism in some intellectual circles in Europe, and it's a bloody dance when it starts going this pendulum swing, because you start to view the world in us against them ways, and when you start using hate as a rhetorical device, as these us against them folks always do, hate eventually leads to violence. And there's a great quote actually by Václav Havel. It says that ideology offers human beings the illusion of dignity and morals while making it easier to part with them. I think we see that over and over again, writ large geopolitically, writ small in America, but it's no less reason to be concerned and take a principled stand against that swing. Yes, sir.
Yes, you referred to Eisenhower and Clinton, and now even to some extent Reagan and Nixon as centrists. And I was wondering whether you have some irreducible minimum of policy that would define as a noble or creative centrist in your view, a centrist whom we should want to follow and look up to.
Well, the reason I begin my book with Teddy Roosevelt is I think he provides sort of the classic example of the leader from the vital center. I think very often in politics there are people who just use centrist strategies to get elected. I believe that it's actually a principled philosophy of government. But the challenges facing a nation change at every time. And so centrism evolves. It incorporates change while remaining true to fundamental American values. And that's one of the real virtues of the center and the strength of the center. You know, the classic mission of politics is the peaceful reconciliation of competing interests. And that's what centrism is really best equipped to provide, the peaceful reconciliation of competing interests. So in the challenges of any time, maybe it was Nixon, and it was time to reach out to China and move foreign policy forward. In Clinton's era, it was time to reform welfare after talking about it for 30 years. The challenges change, but the impulse, that desire to responsibly balance realism and idealism, that remains the same. I mean, that way we never drift too far from fundamental American values. And that's how we remain true and focused, I think, as a country. I'll take another question. Sure.
The politics has a lot of awkward definitions. I didn't understand affirmative action for a long time. And now another one that you keep saying throughout this whole presentation is the lifestyle left. What's the definition of the...
I was trying to create sort of a rhetorical opposite alternative to the religious right. Again, it's based on perceptions. I think the negative perception of the left that holds a lot of currency for people, and remember, you know, to a large extent politics is perception, and a party's own extremist groups are actually the greatest argument against it frequently, even more persuasive than the opposition. I think there's been an association with what I'll call the lifestyle left, with sort of a rob Peter to play Paul, blame America first vision of foreign policy, an instinct towards victimization that's going against the grain of American individualism and independence that I think people feel. The party that affiliates, the party or candidate that affiliates and associates itself with the principles of individualism and moderation will carry the day. And that's part of the struggle, and that's part of the way in which the realignment can occur. I mean, there's so many artificial divisions in politics, but that's the stable ground. And the party that affiliates itself with those principles, they'll carry the day, and certainly the candidate. And behind me, you had a question. Yep.
So I came in late, so you may have already discussed this, but who is your pick for November of 2004 and why?
Well, as an independent, I reserve the right to withhold judgment until November. I think it's going to be a long campaign. And there's so many different factors at play. I'm personally curious to see which candidate ends up embracing the extremist elements of their own party more, and which candidate makes more concerted, determined, reaching out to the center. You know, President Bush campaigned as a centrist, a compassionate conservative. And what's that? It's saying, look, I'm conservative, but I recognize the negative associations the majority of Americans have with the extremists in my party, and I'm not that. I'm compassionate. And that's why throughout the campaign he was relentless. Look, he's talking about education consistently. You know, tax cuts in the military, a strong military were there, but it was really about classic Democrat issues, which was the mirror opposite of the Clinton playbook that he'd used very effectively and governed from. The difference is, I think, that the president, I think, is very mindful of the lessons of his father's term, where the right wing turned against George H.W. Bush viciously, and that in a campaign, a disastrous campaign overestimation led to that Houston convention where they gave primetime slots to Pat Buchanan, and the culture wars were in full fly, and the Americans said, no thanks, that's about enough division for one day. So I think he's governed largely as a conservative. Now he's making an attempt to swing back issues like prescription drug coverage, amnesty for illegal immigrants. I don't think they've really resonated in the way that they were intended to. It's going to be a long campaign. John Kerry's got to show that he can reach out to independents. He's starting to try that and talk about it a lot. He's campaigning as a fiscal conservative, fiscal responsibility guy, bringing down the balanced budget, bringing down the deficit. And it's particularly ironic that that's become an official Democrat position because, of course, it's totally opposite of their historic roles. So I think that's, again, one of the places we see the beginnings of realignment. But we'll see also, I think, John Kerry, it's interesting, just merely his Vietnam combat record has a centering influence on the Democratic Party as a whole. Because for so long, the party was tarred with the drift of the anti-war movement and during Vietnam towards an anti-American movement. For so long, it was considered they basically abdicated a responsible foreign policy or moral foreign policy during the Cold War. So I think it's time, and his candidacy is indicative of a recognition among Democrats that they need to take foreign policy seriously, especially in this age of the war on terror. They need to return to that foreign policy, strong foreign policy tradition of Truman and JFK. What's I think so important is that, you know, Harry Truman used to say that partisanship ends at the water's edge. And the war on terror is far too serious to begin being used as a political football. And I think there's room for a responsible debate about the means to the end. But about the end of winning the war on terror, that we got to be really unified about as a country. And I think the Democratic Party needs to recognize that in particular. Take another question. Sure. Yeah.
Will Juliana and Hillary be running for the presidency anytime soon?
You're a plant, aren't you? Will Giuliani and Hillary be running for president anytime soon? Not in the next 8 months, right? I do not claim to speak for my former boss, who's a leader I greatly admire and respect. But I think, you know, he's a very young guy, and we'll see how he decides he can best contribute to the American dialogue. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and there's a need out there for somebody who's got a demonstrated ability to appeal to moderate Democrats, independents, as well as Republicans. You know, Hillary Clinton's another. I think it's you know, it's the elephant in the living room is that, you know, I think people would be far more shocked if she didn't run for president in 2008. You know, she's impressed a lot of people with the working with Republicans in Congress, in the Senate. Certainly that's a large part of her husband's legacy. But I think it's difficult to run for president when you begin with negatives that are around 50%. You know, I think because the pendulum is swinging, I think let's hope for elections that bring people together rather than divide them. having a really good, honest dialogue about issues and ideas, as opposed to just falling back to ideology when it gets sort of hollow and cheap and predictable. That's what the young Americans, by the way, one of the reasons, so many of us are independents is we don't like the predictability of the extremes. Extremists end up reinforcing stereotypes, and centrists undercut them. They cause people to question their alignments and their associations. And when folks just start parroting the predictable party line, you go to sleep. You don't even need to hear what they're saying, and that ends up degrading the national discourse. I think that's one of the reasons that young America really responds to independent voices and the integrity of the vital center. Can I take another question from the back? Yes, sir?
I actually got two questions. One
Sure.
is, what percentage of the independent vote do you think Bush has to receive in order to win, get reelected? Secondly, how does promoting wedge issues, which tend to polarize the populace, how will that contribute to him gaining independent votes?
With wedge issues in particular, you're playing with fire and you know it. I mean, any attempt to resuscitate the culture wars is it risks alienating folks just as it did in the recent past. I think this country really is increasingly intolerant with intolerant voices. And so I think when you start trying to divide folks with social issues, you're definitely not building upon your base, let's say. And that's a real challenge. I mean, Bush, what we know about the American voter is that only 30% call themselves conservative. So electoral math and all that kind of algebra aside, you're going to need to go past 50% to win. The Democrats have got further to go because their base is only 20%. Only 20% of the American public calls themselves liberal. So that means that they are more dependent upon the vital center to get elected. But the second the Republican Party thinks it doesn't need independents to get elected, that it doesn't need to reach out to the center in a sincere and genuine way, that's when you start heading towards minority status. So it's there are a lot of issues out there, but I think the country doesn't like to be divided. I don't think we get distracted by that red herring as much as we have in the past. I hope not, at least. That's why one of the most interesting movements in politics is, we're starting to see urban Republicans, for example. And these are folks who, they're conservative on a lot of things. They want to shrink the size of government, and they want to reduce crime, and they want to reduce bureaucracies and encourage self-sufficiency. But you know what? Diversity is an everyday experience to them. And this dividing us for short-term political gain by demagogues on either side, it's not going to fly. And that's where the country's going. I mean, we are the most diverse country in the history of the world. We're a nation of immigrants, and that's something to be proud of, not something to move away from. And can I take another question? Yes.
Does the role of the faith-based kind of approach, we see Bush now, I think he's using that more, he's reaching out to both sides. That's the one area with the faith-based issue. But how much do you think that plays a role, particularly with independence?
Sure. I think the questions about the faith-based approach to policy from the White House. What a lot of people don't remember is that Al Gore actually had a very detailed faith-based proposal in his campaign in 2000. But because the Democratic Party wasn't as associated with the organized religious groups in this country, that never really caught fire, captured the public's imagination. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, Al Gore, he campaigned as a raging moderate in 1988 for the presidency. He'd been involved in the DLC from its earliest days. He had a long record of centrist policies, but I think he overreacted to a perceived lack of enthusiasm by the liberal left and kind of hid them all under this cloak of people versus the powerful at precisely the wrong time. Where Bush sort of did the opposite. I mean, he understood how important it was to use the style and symbolism of centrism to send a message. And an important message, too, not purely cosmetic, about an inclusive Republican Party. As far as faith-based go, so many folks in urban America don't fully appreciate just how much of America is evangelical or takes faith very seriously. I think right now we're having this has been one of the defining political movements of our time. But I think it's very dangerous to start having one party be the party of organized religion. I think that becomes very dangerous, because that only fuels the arrogance of the extremists that your opponents aren't merely mistaken, they're sinful, they're evil. And, we do have these voices out there manning the ramparts who really encourage their allies to think of the opposition as evil, as traitorous. And that's always dangerous, but especially now. We don't have the luxury of division. And we need to do a much better job of trying to be inclusive. And when somebody starts spouting the demagogue extremist line, starts being intolerant and demonizing the fellow Americans, we need to make that politically radioactive in American politics. We need to declare that politically incorrect and move forward in a more unified manner. Yes, sir.
So do you think Bush's support of the gay marriage amendment will have any impact on this election?
I do. I think it was Paul Gigot from Wall Street Journal who said either party that embraces this issue is going to lose, either from the negative or the positive side. I think most Americans, basically, they believe in individualism. They believe in equal rights. They want to treat people as individuals. They're very nervous and awkward when folks get, when group rights or special rights start getting thrown around. I think this issue's had a lot of heat and not a lot of light around it. I think the civil union position, ironically, is becoming a considered a centrist position or middle ground on this issue. It's not emotionally satisfying to either side. And when Howard Dean first started discussing this as part of his record as governor of Vermont, it was just about as far out as it could be. But I think the goalposts have changed a bit. We're having a national dialogue about this. If either extremist on either side dominates the dialogue on this, they're going to hurt their own side worse than they are the opposition. Down the road, it's sometimes helpful to look at questions with the perspective of how they're going to look 20 years from now. And love trumps hate eventually. The uniters do beat the dividers eventually. Just, we got to lose some battles to win the war. So, other question in the back? Oh, I misinterpreted that. We mentioned John McCain earlier and the way that his campaign really galvanized folks. And there was a speech he gave that I think is still worth quoting, because it was just 4 years ago, right about now, that he dropped out from the presidential election. He said in Virginia Beach right before, just around 4 years ago, said, "Neither party should be defined by pandering to the outer reaches of American politics and the agents of intolerance, whether they be Louis Farrakhan or Al Sharpton on the left, or Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell on the right." Those are still good words to hear. We need to start remembering that and repeating it and have that begin to shape the dialogue. 9/11 changed the landscape of politics, and it woke a lot of us up. And briefly, it brought us together in that moment when everyone in Congress stood on the steps of Capitol Hill and sang, "God Bless America." It was a great moment. It was a moment of unity. Its beauty came from its unification, from its contrast to the petty partisanship that just dominates and wastes so much time in Washington. But we can't wait for a crisis or a tragedy to bring us together. We really need to do better, and it's the responsibility of the Vital Center to stand up and to make its voice heard and to start exerting its real influence on politics, showing that it's patriotic, to stand up to partisanship, and favoring the national interest over the special interests. And because it's, just by way of closing, it's sort of St. Patrick's Day time around here. And one of the chapters in my book's on John F. Kennedy, and he's very misunderstood in many respects, as is his brother. When he campaigned for Congress in 1946, his campaign slogan was "The Fighting Conservative." And Richard Nixon's in 1946, the same election, was "Practical Liberalism." So the old divides between ideology are not often what they seem. The strength of the center has always been there. It's just it doesn't follow the path of the one party, so it gets lost sometimes in the easy divisions between left and right that are so often hoisted upon us, these false dichotomies. But Kennedy, the night he died, was supposed to give a speech in Texas, November 22nd. He never was able to deliver it, but it had already been written and it was embargoed and handed out to the press ahead of time. And there's a quote from there that I think shows the strength of the Vital Center and its timelessness and the responsibility to look beyond the narrow constraints of self-interest, whether they be party or group or affiliation or tribal affiliation, and look beyond that towards what we share in our genuine responsibilities across party lines. Kennedy was supposed to say the night he died, "This is a time for courage and a time of challenge. Neither conformity nor complacency will do. Neither fanatics nor the faint-hearted are needed. And our duty as a party is not to our party alone, but to the nation, and indeed to all mankind. Our duty is not merely the preservation of political power, but the preservation of peace and freedom." That message is more important now than ever, and I think we would do well to try to carry it forward across party lines in the independent nation. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
John Avlon is a columnist for the New York Sun. Independent Nation is published by Harmony Books, an imprint of Random House. Visit randomhouse.com for more information.